Welcome to History in the Shadow. I am your host, Shahyu.
They came by ship, not as conquerors, not as an army, as traders, with a smile on their face and a business proposal in their hand. They said, "We want to buy your spices. We want to trade with your merchants. We come in peace." But the trade was never about spices. The trade was about power. And what followed over the next 200 years was one of the greatest transfers of wealth in human history, from one of the richest civilizations on Earth to a small island nation on the other side of the world. The next few minutes, you are going to understand exactly how it happened. How a trading company became a government. How a government became a machine of extraction. How 10 million people died in a single famine, while company officials wrote letters to London celebrating record profits. And how the country that once supplied 25% of the entire world's wealth was reduced to one of the poorest nations on Earth by the time the British finally left. This is the real story of British India, not the version that glosses over the uncomfortable facts, the version built on verified historical evidence. Let us begin. Before we talk about what was taken, we need to understand what existed. In the early 18th century, India was not a poor country waiting to be civilized. It was one of the wealthiest civilizations on Earth. Historians estimate that in 1700, India accounted for approximately 24% of global GDP, nearly 1/4 of everything the entire world produced. The Mughal Empire's economy was larger than the entire economy of Western Europe combined. Bengal alone, just one province, generated more revenue than the entire British government collected in taxes at home. Indian textiles were the most sought-after goods in the world. The muslin weavers of Dhaka produced fabric so fine that Europeans called it woven air. A 6-meter sari could pass through a finger ring. Roman emperors had complained centuries earlier that too much Roman gold was flowing to India in exchange for Indian cloth. The trade deficit was always in India's favor. This was not a country that needed to be saved or civilized. This was a country that the entire world wanted to trade with, and that some people wanted to control. The British East India Company arrived on India's western coast in 1608. For the first 100 years, they were exactly what they claimed to be: merchants buying and selling, establishing trading posts with the permission of local rulers. But they were watching, learning, calculating, and waiting for the right moment. The right moment came on June 23, 1757. The place was Plassey, a mango grove in Bengal near the Bhagirathi River. On one side, Surajudollah, the Nawab of Bengal, with approximately 50,000 soldiers. On the other, Robert Clive, commanding a force of approximately 3,000 British and Indian soldiers. On paper, this should not have been close. It was not close, but not for the reason you might think. The Battle of Plassey was not decided by military superiority. It was decided by a conspiracy arranged weeks before a single shot was fired. Robert Clive had secretly approached Mir Jafar, the commander of Surajudollah's army, and made him an offer. "Betray your Nawab, keep your soldiers out of the fight, and when we win, you will be the next Nawab of Bengal." On the day of the battle, Mir Jafar stood in the field with 30,000 soldiers and did nothing. He did not attack, he did not defend. He stood still like a statue while British guns cut down the soldiers who remained loyal to Surajudollah. The battle lasted a few hours. Surajudollah fled, was captured, and was killed shortly afterward. Mir Jafar got his throne as a puppet. The real power now belonged to the East India Company. In 1757, one act of treachery purchased by one company official transferred control of the wealthiest province in India to a British trading corporation. And then the looting began. When Robert Clive entered the treasury of Murshidabad, Bengal's capital, after Plassey, he wrote in his diary that he walked through rooms piled high with gold, silver, and jewels, wealth that would dwarf the entire city of London at the time. Within weeks, that wealth was being loaded onto boats. Contemporary accounts describe 100 large boats on the Ganges River, loaded with gold and silver extracted from Bengal's treasury. Clive personally took between £2 and £3 million for himself, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today. But this was only the beginning. The real extraction was about to be legalized. In 1765, the East India Company obtained the Diwani rights over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa from the Mughal Emperor. This gave the company the legal authority to collect all taxes from these three provinces, home to tens of millions of people. A trading company had become a government. And unlike any government that had existed in India before, this one had no obligation to the people it taxed. Traditional Indian rulers, Mughal, Maratha, Rajput, whatever their faults, operated within a system of mutual obligation. The ruler taxed the people. In exchange, the ruler maintained infrastructure, defended the territory, and crucially, opened the granaries during famines. The East India Company operated on a different principle. Extract the maximum, return the minimum, send the profit to London. Farmers who had previously paid approximately 10% of their harvest as tax now faced demands of 50% or more, not just in good years, every year, drought year, flood year, failed harvest year. The tax demand did not change based on circumstances. It only ever went up. Company officials, called nabobs, traveled through the villages collecting taxes. Farmers who could not pay were flogged, made to stand in the sun for hours. In some documented cases, their children were taken as bond servants until the debt was cleared. Indian he wrote in his agriculture diary that he flowed across the walked-through ocean and was poured Utsa and Pat, government wealth that records, period of colonial rule, accounts describe 100 adjusted to large today's boats on the values. Disputed in its precise methodology, extracted from but the direction of Bengals, moving from Clive, India to Britain, historian. In 1769, the monsoon failed in Bengal. Drought gripped the fields. The rice did not grow. The wells dried up. Farmers who had spent generations feeding the most prosperous province in India stood in their fields looking at cracked earth. What followed is recorded in history as the Bengal famine of 1770, known in Bengali as the Chayatora Manvantara. And what makes this famine historically significant is not the drought. Droughts happen. What makes it significant is what the East India Company did and did not do in response. The company's warehouses were full of grain, stockpiled, controlled, managed by company officials. Rather than distributing this grain to the starving population at cost or below cost, as previous Indian rulers had done during famines, the company sold it at market prices. As famine conditions drove demand up and supply down, prices rose. The company's profit margins on grain increased as people died. A rule was enforced: pay your taxes first. Then, if anything remains, feed yourself. That same year, 1770, with bodies lying in the streets of Murshidabad and Bihar, with rivers filling with corpses, with reports of people eating the bark of trees and the leather of sandals, the East India Company raised its tax collection target by 10%. The justification: if your neighbors have died, you now owe their share too. Historian William Hunter, writing in the 19th century, documented what he found in the records: conditions so extreme that people were reduced to eating the flesh of the dead. Rivers were choked with bodies. Cremation grounds ran out of wood. In a single year, approximately 10 million people died, 1/3 of Bengal's entire population. This was not a natural disaster. The drought was natural. The famine, the mass death, was the product of a deliberate policy of extraction that left no margin for survival when natural conditions failed. In 1772, company official Warren Hastings wrote a report back to London. He noted that the famine had been severe. He also noted in the same report that tax revenues had held up remarkably well despite the population loss. He considered this good news. After destroying Indian agriculture, the British turned their attention to Indian industry, specifically textiles. For centuries, Indian weavers had supplied the world. Dhaka muslin was the finest fabric on earth. Indian cotton, silk, and dyed cloth dominated global trade. By the early 18th century, approximately 1/4 of all cloth traded globally came from India. This was a problem for Britain's domestic manufacturers. British wool and cotton, produced by early industrial methods that were still relatively crude, could not compete with the quality of Indian handloom textiles. British consumers preferred Indian cloth. The British textile industry was under competitive pressure. The solution was not to improve British manufacturing. The solution was to destroy Indian manufacturing. The mechanism was tariffs, and their deliberate asymmetry. Indian cloth exported to Britain faced tariffs of up to 80%. This made Indian cloth so expensive in British markets that it could not compete with domestically produced alternatives, regardless of quality. British cloth imported into India faced zero tariffs. This arrangement was called free trade, but it was free only for one party. For Indian weavers, it was a death sentence. Even with these trade barriers, Indian cloth remained competitive in Indian markets for some time because Indian consumers knew quality. So the company moved from economic suppression to direct destruction. Folk accounts and some documented contemporary sources record that weavers who refused to work exclusively for the company or who taught their craft to others outside company control had their thumbs cut off. Looms were broken. Homes were burned. Village by village, the infrastructure of India's most successful industry was systematically dismantled. In 1834, Governor-General Lord William Bentinck wrote in an official report, "The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India." He was describing a famine of weavers, not caused by drought, but by deliberate industrial policy. Dhaka's population fell from 150,000 to 30,000 as the weaving industry collapsed. Murshidabad, which had been described by contemporary accounts as the equal of London in wealth, became a ghost town. Indian raw cotton was purchased from Indian farmers at artificially low prices, shipped to Manchester's mills, converted into cloth, and shipped back to India, where it was sold at 10 times the original price of the raw material. The Indian farmer produced the raw material. The Indian consumer bought the finished product. The profit stayed in Britain. A country that had clothed the world was left unable to clothe itself. The farmers whose backs had been broken by taxation, the weavers whose thumbs had been cut off, the soldiers whose religious sentiments had been deliberately insulted, the princes whose kingdoms had been annexed under the doctrine of lapse. 2 centuries of accumulated grievance. It needed only a spark. The spark came on May 10, 1857, at Meerut, from a dispute over rifle cartridges that soldiers believed had been greased with animal fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. But the cartridges were the excuse, not the cause. The cause was everything that had happened since 1757. The uprising spread from Meerut to Delhi to Lucknow to Kanpur to Jhansi. For the first time in the colonial period, Hindu and Muslim soldiers fought side by side against the British. Farmers put down their plows and picked up weapons. The princes who had not yet been annexed joined the rebellion. It was the most serious challenge to British rule India had produced. The British response was systematic and documented. Captured rebels were tied to the mouths of cannons, and the cannons were fired. The Grand Trunk Road was lined for miles with bodies hanging from trees, a deliberate display designed to communicate the cost of resistance. Villages that had supported the uprising were burned entirely. Thousands were killed in reprisals. The event that had been called a mutiny by the British, and a first war of independence by Indians, was suppressed by 1858. But it had consequences. The British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India under the Crown. Queen Victoria issued a proclamation promising fair treatment and an end to annexation policy. The looting did not stop. It simply became more organized and more efficient. Railways were built, but primarily to move raw materials from the interior to the ports, not to serve the Indian population. Infrastructure investment went where it served British extraction, not Indian development. The form of colonialism changed. The substance did not. If anyone needed proof that British intentions toward India had not fundamentally changed after 1858, it came on April 13, 1919. Amritsar. Jallianwala Bagh, Baisakhi, the Harvest Festival. Thousands of people had gathered in the enclosed garden, men, women, children, elderly. They were there to celebrate the festival and to protest the recent arrest of political leaders under the Repressive Rowlatt Act. They were unarmed. There was no violence, no weapons. General Reginald Dyer arrived with 50 soldiers and 2 armored cars with mounted machine guns. He blocked the single narrow entrance to the garden. He gave no warning. He issued no order to disperse. He simply said, "Fire." For approximately 10 minutes, until the ammunition ran low, the soldiers fired into the crowd. People tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The walls surrounded them on all sides. In desperation, some jumped into the well in the garden's center. Hundreds died in the water. Official British estimates at the time put the death toll at 379. Indian National Congress estimates were higher, approximately 1,000. The actual number has never been definitively established because the British did not conduct a thorough count. When Dyer was asked to explain his actions in a subsequent inquiry, he said, "I was not going to shoot to disperse the crowd. I was going to shoot to punish them." He added, "It was not a question of merely dispersing them. It was a question of producing a sufficient moral effect, from a military point of view, not only on those present, but more especially throughout the Punjab." He wanted to terrorize an entire province into submission. In Britain, the House of Lords passed a resolution praising Dyer. A public fundraising campaign raised £26,000, equivalent to over £1 million today, as a gift to him from grateful British supporters. The massacre at Jallianwala Bagh did not break the independence movement. It transformed it. A young man named Bhagat Singh was 12 years old when it happened. He collected soil from the blood-soaked garden and kept it with him for the rest of his short life. Udham Singh, who witnessed the massacre as a young man, spent 21 years tracking Dyer's political patron Michael O'Dwyer before assassinating him in London in 1940. Fear had created martyrs. Martyrs had created legends. Legends had kept the fire burning. On August 15, 1947, the British left India, They had arrived finding one of the richest countries in the world. They left behind one of the poorest. India's share of global GDP, which had been approximately 24% in 1700 when British involvement began, had fallen to approximately 4% by 1947, after 2 centuries of rule by the nation that claimed to be bringing progress and civilization. The textile industry that had once clothed the world was gone. The agricultural system that had fed tens of millions had been restructured to serve British export interests. The administrative system left behind was designed for extraction, not governance, and the country had been divided along religious lines, a partition that cost another 1,000,000 lives and displaced 15 million people in the largest mass migration in human history. The British also left India with a significant debt. India was required to pay Britain for the cost of its own administration, and the wars fought to keep it under control. Looting did not, Patnaik's Morhi research, records the House records, public Britain but extracted fundraising wealth from primarily to India campaign move equivalent in Blick Britain but ed dollars. Grateful Indian to put that British number in population perspective supporters. 3 not massacre at trillion Indian development Jallianwala Bagh did not dollars per break year. British output. Here is what the historical record shows. Britain came to India as a trading company. It used treachery at Plassey to establish political control over Bengal. It used that political control to extract agricultural taxes at rates that left no margin for survival in bad years. When 10 million people died in the resulting famine of 1770, it raised taxes. It destroyed India's textile industry through deliberate tariff manipulation and documented physical violence against weavers. It suppressed the 1857 uprising with documented mass atrocities. It massacred unarmed civilians at Jallianwala Bagh, and then honored the officer who ordered the massacre. And it left behind a country that was dramatically poorer than it had found it, divided, indebted, and stripped of the industrial and agricultural infrastructure that had made it one of the wealthiest civilizations on earth. This is not anti-British propaganda. These facts are drawn from British government records, the diaries and reports of British officials, and the work of both British and Indian historians who have spent generations analyzing the available evidence. The Indian independence movement understood this clearly. When Gandhi said that the British had not taken India by the sword but by exploiting Indian divisions, he was not being metaphorical. He was describing the mechanism precisely. The freedom that came on August 15, 1947 was not given. It was taken by the farmers who refused to plant indigo when their families were starving, by the weavers who kept working even when their thumbs had been cut off, by the soldiers who chose a court-martial over loading those cartridges, by the activists who walked into Jallianwala Bagh knowing the political climate and gathered anyway. They paid the price. We breathed the air they won.